Hi again. In Samuel Andrews' Christianity and Anti-Christianity, in their final conflict, published 120 odd years ago, we have anticipated the trials and tribulations that we're currently all going through in terms of tensions in the world, the tension between Christianity and anti-Christianity very plainly before us. Nowadays, it wasn't so plain in Andrews' day. We're in the 6th video, by the way. We've now passed through the preface and the introduction. Now he wants to tell us about the teachings of the Old Testament in regards to anti-Messiah. We now come to the inquiry, what do the scriptures teach us respecting the Antichrist? We begin by asking whether the Old Testament speaks of him as the anti-Messiah. And this leads us to inquire as to the messianic expectations of the Jews in our Lord's day. These, as based upon the covenants and the prophets, had their culmination in the kingdom to be set up by the Messiah. Into the conception of the kingdom there entered three chief elements. The authority of Jehovah, their covenant God, would be established all over the earth. To the Jews, as the covenant people, would be given the highest place among the nations, and the government under Jehovah would be administered by a son of David, under whose rule all peoples would dwell in unity and peace. Jehovah would everywhere be honored as the supreme God, but in Jerusalem would be his temple and the center of all worship. That's the conception of the Jews between the Testaments and in the days of Jesus. By the way, excuse me if I stumble a few times, the print is very small. In regard to the time and manner of the setting up of the Messianic kingdom, it was believed that it would be when the Jews were in great trouble and distress. This is based on Daniel 12, verse 1, by the way. They would be scattered abroad in all lands and subject to cruel oppression and encounter the hostility of all nations. But the Messiah would appear, and through him, Jehovah would deliver them from their oppressors, gather them together into their own land, and fulfill to them all the promises made through the prophets of the prosperity and glory of the Messianic kingdom. The period of trial and judgment immediately introductory to the kingdom would be one of brief duration. At its beginning, the enemies of the Messiah would be active and triumphant, but at the end would be overthrown, and the authority of the Messiah everywhere be recognized. This period of trial, preceding the coming of the Messiah and followed by the kingdom, was known by various names: the day of wrath, the day of judgment, the great and terrible day, the time of the birth throes. As the end of the age or dispensation, it was the last day or last days, and as forming the transition to the Messianic age, it was the conclusion or end of this world and the beginning of the world to come, and we might add the age to come is the way they thought about it. Not the end of the world, the physical world, but the age to come. It was in the last days that both good and evil would come to the full, and the distinction between them be most manifest, and therefore the hostility the greatest. Among all peoples there would be division and strife and hatred, and in the physical world great disturbances and cosmical changes, the end of all being new heavens and new earth in which the righteous would dwell. But whilst the Jews believed that the nations would assemble together and fight against the Messiah at his appearing, did they believe that their enemies would then be united under one head, the anti-Messiah? It is not wholly clear what the Jews believed on this point. The prophecies of Daniel were much read and largely molded the popular expectations as to the future. This prophet uses the symbol of a beast to represent the kingdoms which wasted and oppressed his people. He saw 4 different beasts coming up from the sea, 4 successive kingdoms, each with its special characteristics, but all hostile to the Jews. In the image seen by Nebuchadnezzar in Daniel 2, 4 kingdoms were symbolized by its differing parts of gold, silver, brass, and iron. That the 4th and last is the Roman has been generally held. This beast, according to Daniel 7:24, has 10 horns, the horn being everywhere a symbol of some form of power, which here represent the fullness of its kingly power. The 10 horns out of this kingdom are 10 kings that shall arise, the text says. Among these came up a little horn, having eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth speaking great things, whose look was more stout than his fellows, and who thinks to change times and laws. That this 11th horn symbolized some great persecutor is plain from the words spoken of him, and it is not likely that the Jews of the Lord's day believed that they had had their fulfillment in Antiochus Epiphanes, or in any persecutor of the past. It is more probable that they saw in Antiochus a type of a greater enemy to come, and the last, for after his destruction the kingdom would be given to the saints of the Most High, according to this chapter. Antiochus Epiphanes, by the way, is the king who had desolated not just the Jewish polity or government in Jerusalem about 165 BC, but he'd also desecrated the temple. Understanding the one like unto the Son of Man in 7:13 to be the Messiah, who now takes the kingdom, this would certainly lead to the conception of this last enemy as an anti-Messiah. But that the Jews so understood it is more than we can positively affirm. The same may be said of the little horn of Daniel 8:9, and interpreted as the symbol of a king of fierce countenance, who shall destroy the mighty and the holy people, and also of the willful king of chapter 11, verse 36, though not a few now understand the fulfillment of this prophecy to be wholly in the future. Of their prediction of the one that maketh desolate, that is chapter 9, verse 24, we shall speak in considering the Lord's teachings. If we turn to the other prophets, the words of Isaiah, for instance, 11:4, with the breath of his lips shall he slay the wicked, are translated in the Targum, with the breath of his lips shall he slay Armilus. This shows that at the time of this translation there was a belief that the Messiah would be confronted by a chief personal enemy whom he would destroy. St. Paul applies this to the man of sin, that's 2 Thessalonians 2:8. Of this passage, Delitzsch, in Messianic Prophecies, says, we have an indication that the apostasy of the earth will finally culminate in the Antichrist. Other typical references to the anti-Messiah in this prophet are found by many interpreters in chapter 10, verse 5, where the Assyrian is mentioned, and in 14, verse 12, where Lucifer, the shining one, or son of the dawn, is spoken of, who says, I will ascend into heaven. I will exalt my throne above the stars of God. I will be like the Most High. In the mention of Leviathan, that is in Isaiah 27, verse 1, the swift serpent, the crooked serpent, the dragon that is in the midst of the sea, some find a symbolic pointing out of the anti-Messiah. A reference to an anti-Messiah is found by some in Psalm 110, verse 6. He shall wound the heads over many countries. In the Revised Version, that was, he shall strike through the head in many countries. The singular head being used in the Hebrew, they understand it as equivalent to prince, and to foretell that many countries are to be united in that day, the day of God's wrath, when he shall judge among the nations under one man as their chief. A union of many peoples under one head is spoken of by Ezekiel in chapter 38, verse 2. But it is not easy to identify Gog, the chief prince of Meshech, with the blasphemous oppressors of Daniel. He seems rather to be a distinct enemy, and not improbably a Christian power hostile to the Jews, who will invade their land and oppress for a short time the Jewish people. But at what time or under what conditions we cannot now understand. Whilst then we do not find in the Old Testament any distinct mention by name of an anti-Messiah, we do find predictions that at the time when the Messiah was expected to appear and take the kingdom, there would be arrayed against him the nations acting together in unity. This implies a head, someone who is the leader and possessed of great, if not supreme, power. For instance, he references here Joel 3, verse 2, I will gather all nations against Jerusalem, and Zechariah 14, verse 2, I will gather all nations against Jerusalem to battle. Also, he references Psalm 2, the nations being mocked by God, who's laughing at them for their standing against the one he has imposed or installed as king on Mount Zion. The characters of the oppressors mentioned by Daniel, their hatred of the holy people, their selfish exaltation, their contempt of God and of his times and laws, all mark a period when wickedness is come to the full, and the most bitter enemies of God and his Christ appear. It is not without ground that we may believe that the imprecatory Psalms, especially Psalm 109, may prophetically refer to this man in whom would be concentrated all hostility to Jehovah and the saints. We may then accept the language of Professor Briggs in his book Messianic Prophecy. He said, "It is not unnatural, but rather in accordance with the analogy of prophecy, that the hostile kingdoms should not only increase in extension, but also increase in intention. We might reasonably expect that a great hostile monarch, an anti-Messiah, would precede the advent of the Messiah himself. The sufferings of the people of God would reach their climax under the anti-Messiah." End of Briggs' quote. Andrews concludes this chapter saying that the Jews of the Lord's day, or at least many of them, believed that the general hostility of the nations to them as the covenant people would find its last expression in some mighty one, their leader, who would be overthrown by the Messiah, although nowhere distinctly asserted by the prophets, cannot well be doubted. But was this anti-Messiah to be a heathen man or an apostate Jew? Some have seen a prophetic intimation that he would be a Jew in the mention by the prophet Zechariah in 11 verse 17 of the idle shepherd or foolish shepherd. Thus Franz Delitzsch says, quote, "If the good shepherd is the image of the future Christ, the foolish shepherd is the counterpart of Christ, that is, the lawless one, in whom the apostasy from Christ culminates. A heathen ruler is not meant, but one proceeding from the people having the name of the people of God." Then Andrews says, but on the other hand, those whom the later Jews regarded as types of the anti-Messiah were heathen, as Balaam and the Assyrian. It is not likely that the Jews believed that any one of their number would so fall from the faith as to deny the special calling of his people, or that an apostate Jew would be received by the heathen as their head. They saw rather in the anti-Messiah, if indeed they had any definite conception of him as an individual, one who did not recognize their claim to be God's chosen people or the claim of their Messiah, a Gentile who hated the Jews for their religious exclusiveness and pride, and who presented himself as the leader of their heathen enemies. And this debate still goes on, by the way. Is this Antichrist a Jew or a Gentile? I'll put a link in to Daniel 11 and 12, where we discuss what the Watchtower does with these chapters about the willful king, who Paul seems to link to the man of lawlessness in chapter 2 of 2 Thessalonians. The willful king and the Watchtower, house of cards, because if you don't take this geographical details of these chapters 11 and 12 seriously, you're totally lost in trying to interpret who this last enemy of God really is. I'll also put in a link to the Daniel playlist, by the way, where we flesh out a lot of problems the Watchtower will have with this book, which they seem to like for their own reasons, but which actually undermines most of their key doctrines. See you next time.